there, Banditos. It's Wednesday, so that means there's another episode of the Dollar Bin Bandits coming right at you. But as always, before we get to that, let's get to the introductions. I am Joe Marcello.
I'm Warren Phillips.
And we hope everyone had a fantastic, safe, and joyful 4th of July, and you're all recovering nicely. And what better way to do that than with one of our podcasts? But before we do that, let's not forget to thank our new sponsor, Tomorrow's Publishing. That's TWOMORROWS.com. And let's get to the interview, shall we? Today, we're bringing you our interview with, quite frankly, another legend of the comic book world. I mean, that's what we do here. We bring you interviews with legends. We call everyone a legend, but you know what? In actuality, they are. Today, we're bringing you our interview with none other than Howard Chaykin. Do I really need to go into his bona fides? I mean, come on, guys. This is just, I mean, a living legend of the comic book world. We get to talk about his work with Gil Kane, the World of Krypton, one of my favorites. And again, he's another one of these guys who schooled me in Superman. Opened my world up to a new Superman, or actually an old Superman book. So when we get into it, it's a really interesting interview.
Yeah, he we talked a little about Star Wars, American Flagg, and he's an artist, he's a writer, he's excellent at both. One of the people who is just loved by fans. Like you mentioned Howard Chaykin, people, oh yeah, of course Howard Chaykin. So generous with our time. And we were just had the pleasure of talking with him. So here we go, Howard Chaykin.
How are you, sir?
I'm just this side of fabulous.
Damn right.
I'm a glove.
We're really excited to get into this interview. We've been wanting to speak to you for a long time. Your career spans just decades. You've worked on some great work. And we're gonna, we're gonna kick it off with the same question we ask everyone, and that is, how did you discover comic books?
A story I've told a lot. I'm telling it again in the third volume of Hey Kids Comics. I was 4 years old. The summer of 1955. I had two cousins, one of whom was 8 years older than me, one of whom was 10 years older than me. Whose mother spoiled them rotten, who gave them everything. They had more toy soldiers than anybody, and I'd never seen comic books. And they gave me a Frigidaire refrigerator crate filled 2/3 full of comic books. This is like 54, so they dated back to the late 40s, as long as that period, that's 6 or 7 years. And I climbed into the box, and I can still recall the sense memory of that paper. I was flabbergasted by it. There was something totemic about the material. It really had an impact on me that is transcendent of just junk. Within a year, I was able to read on the 4th grade level because although I couldn't pronounce the words, I could parse them out by dint of their relationship with imagery. My parents, who were fucking morons, presumed that I was some sort of genetic anomaly. They made no connection to the fact that comic books, profound literacy. And since that time, I've been a lifelong reader. I mean, I'm a deep reader of all stuff, except for comic books. I don't read comic books anymore because most of them are utter junk. And that was it. I mean, at 4, I identified the fact that this was not an organic thing, but a man-made object, that someone made these things, that I wanted to be one of those people who made these things, and that I would do everything I possibly could within my power to become one of those people. And that's what I did. I don't identify as someone with a great deal of will, but I willed myself into becoming this person. And I had no idea where it came from, other than in just blind rage and hunger, because I'm not particularly skilled. I'm not talented in a profound way. I'm a grind, and I had to teach myself how to do this. And I've come to understand that beyond, I don't believe in coincidences, but there's a cosmic connection to the fact that the summer I discovered comics was the same year that the Comics Code Authority was imposed upon comic books. And that from that point on, comic books became a moron's medium. It became an infantilized product because the Comics Code Authority drove away anybody who might have been interested in a transgressive growth spurt that comics seemed to be on the cusp of. But that growth spurt was just literally cut off the knees, to mix too many metaphors, by the Comics Code. And I have to explain that, I was not this elitist asshole that I am now then. I loved comic books. I just loved everything about them. I particularly loved super comics. I just thought they were the greatest things in the world. I was just old enough to discover the Flash when it came out in Showcase, and Green Lantern when it came out in Showcase, and the Hawkman stuff. Those 6 issues of Kubert's Hawkman in Raven Bold are canon. Everything else in Hawkman does not exist for me. It's like a false prophet. That's Old Testament stuff. Nobody drew Hawkman like Kubert did. And I love this work enormously. I mean, and as much as I regard Robert Kanigher as one of the worst people who ever lived, I adored his Wonder Woman stuff and the Metal Men stuff. Because as I said recently, it was 4 martini lunch writing. It was fantastic. And it was just absolutely bug fuck batshit stuff. I adored it. And when I outgrew a lot of my taste for that work, I returned to it with different eyes many, many years later and saw it through different eyes and welcomed it back and rejected some. But it's from the minute I discovered comics, it was all I wanted out of my life. I'm a comic book man. I really am. And by that, I mean that I love the language of comics. When I became a comic book fan as a boy, I love the content of comics. But when I became a producer of comics, I love the form of comics. And I have issues about what comics have become because of that form.
So
long answer, short question.
No, there are no long answers, short answers. They're only your answers.
No, wrong answers. There are a lot of long answers.
So you made your way into the comic book industry and you apprenticed under Neal Adams.
Well, before that, I worked for Gil Kane.
Okay.
Gil Kane is the single most important male influence in my life.
Okay. Period. I'm glad you mentioned that. I was going to ask, you had a chance to work with Gil Kane and Wally Wood, correct?
Or Wallace Wood, yes.
What you mentioned,
he like being called Wally any more than I like being called Howie.
Okay, fair enough.
He was Woody. I owe my career to 5 guys. That's Wallace Wood, for Gil Kane, Wallace Wood, Gray Morrow, Neal Adams, and Joe Orlando. Orlando because he rabbied me at DC Comics and taught me how to navigate the corporate structure, because I was loathed by Carmine Infantino because of my associations with Gil Kane, who he despised. And I owe my entire career, the way I think about comics, the fact that I think about comics from a perspective to which I do, to Gil Kane. He was an autodidact like me, or I'm an autodidact like he was. He sucked when he started, much less sucky than I did, because I really sucked. And like me, he taught himself not to suck because he felt he had to. And the difference between me and those 5 guys is that I can write. And none of them could write worth a shit. They were just terrible writers, just awful. Gil could write essay brilliantly. He could articulate his sensibilities, but he could not write comics. And Woody wrote just shit. And Gray couldn't write either. Gray just wrote to his own fantasies. And Neal, please. I mean, Christ. That stuff is just, it's like, there was a writer in comics in the 70s who was the most read over the phone in the middle of the night by artist to artist. Neal replaced that guy. By the same token, I thought that a lot of the criticisms that Neal received toward the end of his life over his work were unwarranted and unjustified. As baroque as his work had become, he was still an astonishing draftsman. He really was. He just drew phenomenally well. His drawing was just nonpareil. So that's really the separation. But I owe everything to those 5 guys, particularly to Gil, although Neal was the one who got me work. Neal was the one who basically strong-armed editors at DC Comics to give me work. And I wasn't worthy of the work. I mean, understand, I sucked. But Neal was an intimidating figure. He was the kind of guy, if you don't do it, I'll beat you up. He was a threatening character. He really was. I mean, I don't think he would have beaten him up, but he had that affect, like, do this or I'll kill you, that kind of shit, And it changed my life. It really did. I mean, I wasn't available to do the work. I wasn't good enough to do the work, but I had the work to do. It wasn't really, it was 10 years later that I developed a work ethic that made me understand of how to focus and concentrate on doing work that didn't interest me. Much of comics is doing work in the service of material that is beneath your dignity. You have to accept that as a given if you're going to work in mainstream comics, because much of it is just shitty. It really is. It's aimed at an audience whose standards are laughable at best, and and the writing in comics, most writing even to this day, most guys who write in comics are guys who failed as artists, and the ones who say they aren't that guy, they're lying, because nobody's attracted to comics because of the text. And first, they're attracted to it for the context and the subtext. So, you were saying?
I want to jump around a little bit in your career. Just talk briefly, because we really haven't spoken to many people who worked on the for Atlas at all. It seemed like a really, I would say, a good idea, but a forward-thinking idea of how they were putting Atlas together. For you, what went right and what went wrong with the Atlas line? And I want to talk to you a little bit about Scorpion.
Well, Atlas really existed because what's his name? Marty Goodman had no idea why Marvel was successful. Nobody did. I mean, nobody really did. People thought it was Stan. What Marvel was successful because of a synchronicity and a synergy that existed between what Jack Kirby found, what Stan Lee was able to pull out of Jack, and the audience being available to that thing at that moment. Archie tried to do it with the Mighty Crusaders. Tower tried to do it with the Thunder Agents. Nobody could do it because it didn't exist. It was not a thing you could do. It was a synergistic idea. And Goodman got pushed out, and he was resentful. And he needed to get his kid a job. So he basically bought Swank magazine and installed his son Chip, who was as loungy a lizard as you could find, and the editor of Swank magazine. And he instituted a comic book line. He hired a guy to edit the line. He hired Larry Lieber to come over. And, there was this idea that there was DNA available, and it really wasn't. What Atlas did was Atlas raised rates across the board for the entire business. Everybody got a raise from everybody because Atlas raised the rates. And they returned artwork. They treated, I don't think they intended to be good. They just treated people in a better way than Marvel and DC was at the time. And I'm pretty sure they went belly up with me owing them work. I have no recollection. I'm pretty sure I got paid in advance for something I didn't do.
Right.
But I had a very similar experience years later when I was asked to create. I was supposed to develop the Mighty Ducks for Disney. And in my version of the Mighty Ducks has nothing to do with what ended up being on screen, because what ultimately came down to it was that they wanted the Mighty Ducks to be the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, because it's one more time of grabbing synergy and finding a way to make it do it again. You can't make Northern Exposure again. If you remember Northern Exposure, everybody was chasing. Let's you can't do that. It just doesn't happen. And the same thing is true with Marvel and DC at Atlas. They did a Conan book. They turned the Scorpion into a Spider-Man book. They just, they had no idea what they were doing. And again, it wasn't editorial. Yet the problem was not editorial; it was publishing. The people who edited the books were, we're not fools. And Larry's not a bad guy. He was pretty funny, and I had a good time hanging around up there because it was a fun office to visit. It was around the corner from Marvel Comics. One of the best things about it was when Walter and I left there one day, we were assaulted by a bunch of Hasidic Jews, asking us asking Walter, not me, asking Walter whether he tied his tefillin that day because he misread as a Jew. Walter's Norwegian, come on, man. And Walter had no idea what these fuckers were talking about. It was fantastic. That's what you get living in New York City. That's the best.
That's true.
Let's fill in Mobile.
Was Scorpion an idea you had in your back pocket for a while, or just something you just came up with to
No,
build? Okay,
pulled it out of my ass.
gotcha.
You know, I like the idea of an immortal guy because I loved. I mean, I'm in the process right now of drawing the second half of issue 3 of volume 3 of Hey Kids,
Right.
and I'm doing the sequence where just a series of moments in this particular issue, the character who is an avatar of me goes through the various stations of the cross that lead him to where he is. And one of the stations of the cross, extant and separate from that Creative Comics, was buying my first Edgar Rice Burroughs novel. Mm-hmm. And I cannot convey to you this the Saul on the Road to Damascus nature of transformation that happened when I read that comic book the day before. It was October the 25th, 1963, because I was born mitzvah on the 26th. And I read it that day, the night before. I was like, and I had German measles, so I was hallucinatory. So it was fabulous. But that the immortality of John Carter, that idea, and a hero who didn't work altruistically, because I mean, what was I? I was 22, 23 at this point, and I'd come to understand that there was no motivation for characters in comic books to do what they did. Years later, this would come up as a really big point in when the studios all of a sudden that discovered that comics were a potential of value as narrative source. None of the old guys, the older men in the executive, one of the reasons it took so long for comics to achieve their place as narrative source in the Hollywood business was that the guys who held the purse strings had no connection with them. They'd stopped reading them when they were children, whereas the guys who were working with them, the younger guys, were still reading them in college. And the dealing with studio executives trying to explain why does he do this? You can't answer that question because there's no answer, because it's really stupid. He does it because he's a comic book character. Right. It wasn't until the guys who'd grown up reading comics in college got into control of the studios, then all of a sudden the floodgates opened and they moved in because they didn't need to know the motivation. But I felt it was important to create a character who did what he did for a living. And I have no idea why, but it seemed valid and relevant. And I was obsessed with the 1930s. I loved chords and I loved P-26s. I loved all that shit. And again, it was the beginning of a point of view, but it wasn't quite there. It was it was like bad baking, but at least I was baking. I'd moved from cooking to baking. You know, cooking is chemistry, baking is physics. And I'd begun to have an idea, but it took literally 8 years for that idea to develop into a concept, because ideas are worthless unless you can execute them. Right. And if I were to do the Scorpion today, mm-hmm. it would bear no resemblance to what it looked like back then. It would not be so busy. It would be more linear in design. It would be cleaner and cleverer, I believe. But Dominic Fortune grew out of that. Because I literally, when I got into an argument, they decided they wanted Alex Toth came in and did an issue of the Scorpion and changed everything. Then it became the Spider-Man book. Mm-hmm. So I went across the street to Marvel and said, how about doing the Scorpion over here? What do you say? And I said, okay, let's do that. That's how casual the business was in those days. And again, I gave them away. I gave a character away. I don't own these characters. Was that stupid? Probably. Was I ignorant of what I was doing? Not in the least. Mm-hmm. Whenever I hear that phrase, "comics will break your heart, kid," the subtext of that is one of innate narcissism, in that because I'm different from everybody else, I expect to be treated differently by a business that has ground everybody else I know into ground beef. Right. Comics didn't break my heart because I came in with my eyes open. When I hear guys in my generation bitter about the way they've been treated by comics, what do you expect? There's that wonderful line in Michael's book, The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay, where Sammy Clay says to George, the editor, he says, they'll do right by us, right? And George says, to the letter of the law, and that's, legal and ethical, two very different concepts,
Just a quick, going back to Scorpion for a second, on your timeline from when you created him to where you are now, Where does Dominic Fortune fall into your ideal of what the character should be?
All I did with Dominic Fortune was to make him Jewish.
Okay.
And lose the supernatural aspect of it and make him a criminal, a guy who would literally, I mean, we were all of us were real movie guys back then. I mean, this is in a pre-videotape age. We haunted the revival houses and we haunted the museum shows. One of the things we all learned about was the history of Hollywood. I mean, I was really fascinated by that. Reading Kevin Brownlow stuff. And one of the things, I mean, it took a while for us to understand because of when we lived and when we weren't very smart, just how far apart the country was geographically until our time, till our boyhood, when jet travel, when airplane travel became a perfectly acceptable way for middle and lower middle class people to travel. I'm old enough to remember pre-regulation airplanes. I mean, my first flights, I wouldn't ever consider getting on an airplane without a sport coat, at least, and a necktie. Okay, now people walk on in their fucking underwear, and I was fascinated by the idea, but that even in the 1930s, California and New York were by an airplane a 2-day ride, by a train a 7-day ride, by a car a 15-day drive. So there was no interstate, and the idea that a criminal could run away from New York and get to California and get away with it seems like a fun idea to do, And I like the idea of playing in the entertainment business. I've always liked entertainment adjacent stories. I've got a bunch of them that are always floating around, and that's how it grew.
So, I wanted to ask about your time working at National Lampoon.
I was not staff. I freelanced.
Okay, so but during your time working on that, what was that experience like going from, I mean, it's a different, I'm assuming, business structure compared to comics, although not that far out, but it seems like they're working with just batshit crazy people too.
They weren't so crazy. They were a bunch of Catholic anti-Semites out of Canada and Harvard. They were all basically Jew. They were just Jew baiters. And I mean, I mentioned Joe Orlando earlier. Orlando was the one who lied through his teeth to the Lampoon guys about how much money guys from comics were making. So the rates at Lampoon were astronomical because of Joe Orlando. He was, oh yeah, we're getting millions of dollars. They're just the billions of dollars. And the Lampoon had a lot of money to spend. I liked working over there. I really did. I liked Michael Gross. He was a good guy. I worked with him over the years in various different ways. I worked with him when he became Ivan Reitman's right-hand man, and when he was doing heavy metal and stuff like that. My office at Universal was around the corner from his. And I liked the Lampoon guys. I got along with them reasonably well. They were condescending. They were anti-Semites. I mean, anecdotally, when I met one of the second generation guys who came down from Canada, his first words to me upon being introduced to me was, "Oh, you're the little kike." There's a lot of charm built into that, but
it was a different time.
Nothing goes by you, Mr. Marcello. But it was the money was great, the experience was fun. And I became very friendly with Julie Simmons, Maddie's daughter, who they sort of suffered, who was a lovely woman. She really was. And that led to heavy metal, it shared an office. So I met Lou Stathis, who was one of the best people I've ever known in my life. We each regarded each other as the darkest spirited person we'd ever met. No, you're darker. No, you're darker. No, trust me. I looked it up. You are bleakly spirited, much more so than me. It was that kind of conversation. He died very, very young, and he was just a really, really good guy. Just a stand-up cat.
Just talking to you and everything, I'm very curious, when in your career, it'll be sort of a two-part question. First, as an artist, when did you feel you hit your stride? When did you gain your confidence that you belong in the industry? You've made the right choice. This is what you should be doing. Same question with you as a writer.
It happened simultaneously.
Okay.
Because I never felt I really was. I mean, I had no real work ethic. Mm-hmm. And the first 10 years of my career were me looking for something, trying to find a point of view.
Mm-hmm.
And when I got shit canned at Marvel and was driven out of the business for about 18 months, nearly 2 years, and I went and made a living as a paperback painter, I thought a lot about stuff. And I think a lot about stuff because it's what I do. And when First Comics, for reasons which I to this day have no idea why they thought that I was worthy, made me an offer financially, which made it possible for me to get out from under the debt that I had accrued working for Byron Price. And I never made a dime working for Byron. I spent from 1975 to 1980 or so, until I was making money in paperbacks, I was not so much kiting checks, but living check to check and running out credit cards because Byron paid me nothing. I did the Star Wars stuff just before the royalty system came in, so I made no money off of that. And I made an additional $15 a page, no more than that, on the millions of copies they sold of that book. And again, it's like those restaurants where the food is really lousy, but the portions are really small. The work I did wasn't really very good, but it did save the company. There is
little things like that.
Well, but the fact is, comics isn't a meritocracy, so it doesn't really matter. So it wasn't until Flagg is where everything comes together. As a writer, because basically, I'm not the best draftsman in the world. I'm not the best writer in the world, but what I am is someone who going back to the word of synergy, the synergy that exists between the writing I do and the drawings I do together. That is the text, and it's what makes the stuff important, at least from my perspective. I don't draw as well as many people. I write as well as a lot of people. Trust me on this. But the fact is, it's the combination of those two ideas, because the writing in comics is not simply words. The writing in comics is the delivery, is the delivering pictures and images of narrative value. Mm-hmm. One of the things that I talked about, I've come to understand that in our time, comics has gone from being a medium to a genre, and that's a lot of that is because of the people who are running the game in Hollywood, and they see comics through the same scrim. It's one of the reasons why Riverdale looks like a superhero show. It's dark and grim, even though it's about Archie and his friends. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I find the saddest about all this is that the one thing that comic books have, that comic strips don't have, that animated films don't have, that movies don't have, is the one thing that's being lost in the transliteration of comics, because the content of comics is what's being transliterated. And that's the page, the single page of comics, the page that precedes it and the page that follows it. The page itself as a spatial representation of time, as a series of images of narrative value, that is being lost. And you have an entirely marginally, mostly subliterate talent pool who don't understand that the page itself has to have narrative value and beauty. And since comic books now are being the alphas in comics and our writers, that they have reduced lettering, coloring, and art to material that is in the service of narrative. And it's a delivery system for the writer's concept. And what artists don't understand, and most of them don't understand it because they're too busy putting one over on the man, like being a rebel, is that they can control the game, but they're not smart enough and mature enough to compete with the overweening cleverness of writers. And the average comic book artist doesn't read anything other than comic books, comic book related material. If I get on a plane one more time and see a grown man and woman reading Harry Potter or the Twilight books, this is children's shit. And even if you're making a living drawing pictures of children's shit in superhero comic books, you should be reading on a more elevated level than the work you're producing professionally. And they don't. They don't regard reading as having any tangential value to the work they do. And I think that's just asinine. It's ridiculous.
How important was it for you as a writer to have an artist you can trust to make sure that what you're putting down and what you're writing is captured in the best way possible artistically?
It happens really rarely.
Okay.
It's very rare. Because most artists are lazy and they only want if I'm working with a writer, and the writer asks me what I want to draw, I realize I'm working with a fraud.
Okay.
Because that's just bullshit. That is just that's an asshole question. My job is not to draw what I feel like drawing. My job is to do artwork that services the narrative. And if he's going to tailor his writing to what I feel like drawing, then he's obviously not. Then he's not a serious person. He's not taking the work that he's doing seriously. I feel that the Twilight material that I did with Garcia Lopez is it staggered me. I've also, a couple of years back, I wrote a 10-page Zorro story that I did not know was going to be drawn by Eduardo Risso, which staggered me. It was an educational experience seeing his interpretation of my script. My scripts, I might add, are incredibly OCD, since I believe that the writer's responsibility is to control the scale of the narrative, what picture should be, what needs to be emphasized and have value. My scripts directly relate to the size and shape of the panel. They describe stuff in the panel as they are to be depicted in order. Okay. And it's difficult for artists to do that because most artists don't like to do the kind of work that I ask to be done. They're more interested in sensation than sublimation. You have an entire generation of guys who came up out of the 90s. In the 90s, comics were just basically about masturbatory homoerotic imagery. Men who obviously looked like steroided versions of Tom of Finland drawings, and women who looked like transvestites with enormous breasts. And that sensibility, you've got an entire, and again, those guys are now matured. Many of them have moved on to doing different stuff, but a lot of those guys are still drawing the same shit they did, more polished perhaps in some cases not. But these guys have in an alternate universe, in a just world, they'd be airbrushing wizards on the sides of battle trucks. Come on, man.
That's the quote of the year.
That is really funny.
True.
Yeah.
Tell me I'm wrong.
No, I make a fair point there.
Unless we get them on the show.
Say what?
Unless we get some of these people on the show,
right? Of course, then you apologize to that.
And we love them, and they're the greatest things that ever happened.
Right? Yeah. Can I have your cigarettes when you're finished?
So let me ask you, what is just containing this question to the world of comic books, not movies or TV.
That's all we're talking about, right?
So no, just as it pertains to what I'm going to ask you, what is your take on the comic book industry as a whole today? I'm as a comic book reader, I read a lot of stuff now, and I find myself looking beyond, the big two, Marvel and DC, and there's some great work out there. I mean, you have some, thankfully the internet makes it possible for everyone to find something that they can identify with and enjoy. What is your take on the comic book industry compared to, 20 years ago, 30 years ago? Do you think it's crap or better, worse?
I don't know. I mean, as I say, comics is my hobby now. I'm in the end run. I mean, I'm 72 years old. I aged out of Marvel and DC a decade ago. I was told in January of 2012 I'd have scripts in April. I'm still waiting. So I have no idea. I'm not really particularly interested. I mean, I hear people getting pissed off and bored about Marvel comic books and DC comic books. And well, you're not 11 anymore. You outgrow. People have a real aversion to the idea that they've outgrown their childhood enthusiasms. I'm a member of a number of Facebook groups, and one of them, I'm a member of a Marx Playset group. And because I was a toy soldier boy when I was a kid. I loved that shit so much. And I love visiting this website and seeing these guys my age and older getting completely cranked up about this shit. And it's the same as comic books. I'm always interested in someone turning me on to a comic book that would change my mind about comic books. Mm-hmm. And that hasn't happened a lot. I mean, the last two books that I've read that I just loved, I loved Tony Fleeks's and I forget his partner's name, Stray Dogs. I thought Stray Dogs was just sensational. I loved it. And I bought copies of it for my grandchildren. That's how much I dug it. and Stephen Frank's Palomino, which you probably never heard of.
No.
Palomino is a crime piece that takes place in the country western scene of North Hollywood in the 1980s, when there was the whole Bakersfield and San Bernardino sound was prevalent on the Lancashire and Magnolia area of North Hollywood. It's all gone now. But Nudies of Beverly Hills, you know Nudies?
No.
You guys listen to country western music at all?
No.
Right.
I don't.
If you think about country western stage wear,
yep.
You know, the flamboyant outfits these guys
yep.
wear,
Yep.
They're all made by a Russian tailor who fled Russia in the early 1900s, who refashioned himself as a cowboy tailor in North Hollywood, and he ran a place called Nudies. And all of this stuff, the Flying Burrito Brothers, the Birds, they you know, just all that flamboyant, the Porter Wagner stuff is all out of him. He was just this 3 foot tall little Jew Russian midget who drove a Cadillac with huge horns on the front and wore a 10-gallon hat. He was absolutely batshit. And there were a lot of nightclubs that pivoted around that area. And it's just a terrific book. It really is. Stephen is an animation designer. He was on the What If show for Marvel. He came over to work on Iron Giant. He's just the greatest. I love his work so much. But I'm always interested in seeing other stuff that people think are good, and I'm frequently disappointed. You know, I mean, I was on a panel a couple of years ago at a convention in the Midwest. And I was with these two guys who were like, you know, interchangeable hipsters. You know, they were like, the one looked just like the other, and they were talking about a book they collaborated on. It sounded really interesting. I bought a copy of the book. I bought the trade. I read it on the way home, and it was 5 issues, 100 pages. Okay. Of everything was brown. The characters literally stood facing each other and spoke. There was no acting on the part of the figures. And most specifically, there wasn't a single subjective image of a character in the book identifying that the reader was a presence in the experience. And there are 6 people involved in a comic book. There's an editor, a writer, an artist, a colorist, a letterer, and a reader. The reader is the engine, the physical engine that turns the page. And it's a really good idea to identify and remind the reader that they know you're there when you're doing a book. And, you know, I like books that are well drawn, but I also like books that have that same synergy that I talk about in my own work, that a relationship between text and visuals. That relationship is what it's about. That's what made Stray Dogs transcendent. That's what made Palomino transcendent. That the text and the visuals can work together. Like Scalped, you know, the Jason Aaron book with one of the many Gorons, you know, had that real feel to it. You know, 100 Bullets, at least the first 35 issues. I mean, when Axel was editing it, when Axel left the book meandered a lot. Axel Alonso was a phenomenal editor. Okay, he really was. He may still be, but I don't know. But that book felt like it was done by one person. It had a genuine collective feel. And I didn't pick up on it when I first looked at it. I was like, this is not, you know. But then I when I dug into it, amazing. And so much of that amazing was because of the editorial discipline that Axel laid on Brian and on Eduardo. Because nothing those guys have done together that Axel was not edited is anywhere nearly as good as those 30 some odd issues of 100 Bullets. They're nonpareil. They really are. They're just brilliant.
That's a really good series too. And I was aware of it obviously from when it came out, but I only just got into it probably about 4 or 5 years ago. And it's one of those books that I kind of come back to, you know, after a while. I'm like, hey,
you have to admit, the first 30 some odd issues are where the
absolutely. And
yeah,
it was
a little wandery after that.
And yeah, until you just stated that, I was like, yeah, that's about right. And I wasn't aware of kind of all those changes behind the scenes for that to happen, and it makes complete sense. But yeah, now I'm gonna go back and read it now.
Well, I mean, I'm a guy. I really believe in the job of an editor. You know, I have an editor on the stuff I do for Image. Image is no, you know, is historically there's no editorial input or oversight at Image. So I hired someone to be my editor. And every idea he has cost me time and money. And 95% of those ideas are worth losing the money and the time in the service of. Okay. I had a long conversation with Ed Piskor and Jim Rugg over dinner at Baltimore a couple of years back about this. And I felt that you cannot lose by having someone good to work with as an editor. And I've been really lucky. You know, I mean, I've worked with Joey Cavalieri and I've worked with Axel Alonso, who are two of the best writers working in editors working in mainstream comics. They're both raging pains in the ass, but every single thing they put me through had value. And that's not true of many editors at other companies. It's just not.
Were they not pains in the ass, or just?
No, they're inept. I mean, one of the things about Marvel and DC right now, both, is that there were no art directors working at either company. Every one of the editors at DC Comics and Marvel Comics comes at comics from a literary perspective. They're dealing with it in terms of content. They have no knowledge of the production of the form. They know from pretty pictures, but they're easily intimidated and fooled by beauty that is not in the service of narrative. And writers aren't any, and writers are pretty much the same.
It seems like they're, and correct me if I'm wrong, but they're both trying to find those rock star, artists and or writers. And
they'd rather have rock star writers.
Yeah. Because
they can intimidate artists. But writers are transient. I mean, comics is a business, and it has been for the past, say, two or three decades, in which writers move through comics. Writers see comics as a means to create IP and develop a reputation and end up working in television or movies. Whereas artists, no matter what they do, are still dealing with a skill set that has no real value or use outside of comic books. The storyboard business doesn't really exist. When I was a kid, when I was in my 20s, and comics paid so shitty, and comics really paid shitty in those days, I cannot tell you how little money I made from comics. I subsisted primarily on advertising artwork, which I learned how to do from Neal. I did comps, and I did, not movie storyboards, not animation storyboards, but television commercial storyboards. I did endless comps for Old Gold cigarettes. I did work for J. Walter Thompson on the Ford campaigns, and it was sustaining. I mean, if I was lucky enough, I'd get a week's worth of work of $1.50 a day at doing teeny frames at JWT or B&B. You'd sit there, you'd go in there, you show up at 9 o'clock, work until 5, have a cubicle, and you'd be drawing these 2x3 frames. And it was just $150 a day in the 70s was a fucking miracle. I was getting paid $23 a page for pencils.
Wow.
And I could, for $150, that was rent.
Yeah.
Come on.
So I want to, come back to some of the work you've done, and as you can see, I'm a Superman fan. So I wanted to ask about.
Really?
Yes. You could, yeah. Look at all that stuff.
I was as well.
And therefore, I was going to ask you about working on World of Krypton. How did you get involved in that?
I have no idea. I was too high. I have no recollection. I really don't. I was smoking a lot of pot back then. I really don't know.
That's the best answer I've ever had for anything.
It's true. I mean, it's come on. I was high most of the 70s and 80s. I mean, for me, I was a Golden Age collector when Golden Age collecting was actually an affordable thing you could do. I had a good 30, 40 issue run of mid-war action comics that I didn't pay more than $2.50 a piece for, and they were good to very fine condition. Okay. And I was a huge fan of Fred Ray and Jack Burnley. The Golden Age Superman stuff was just absolutely my magnificent obsession. I loved it. And I loved Jerry Robinson's Batman. I really did. And I mean, I still hold a huge and fond memory for the Fleischer Superman cartoons. Growing up in New York City, you're both kids, you don't remember this, but back when television was like, three networks and three shitty independent stations, WOR, Channel 9 in New York.
I remember that.
Well, I know you do. At 7:30s on Sundays was something called Terry Toon Circus. It was hosted by the guy named Claude Kirshner, who was this humorless doer, obviously alcoholic wife beater, just a horrible human being. I have no idea. I'm sure he's long dead. Who cares? And I would sit there and watch that show because once every couple of weeks, they would show one of the Fleischer Supermans. This is in pre-VCR time. And I would have just one of those just absolute batshit conniptions because they were just, everything about that stuff just sung for me. It was fantastic. Have you read, as a Superman fan, I'm going to ask you a question. If your answer is no, I will hold you in contempt for the remainder of this conversation.
Oh, pressure.
Pressure is it? Have you read Tom DeHaven's book, It's Superman?
No. Good night, everybody. I'll see you later.
Sorry, Howard.
I'm making a note right now.
I cannot believe this.
Was it written by Aesop?
What's that?
You're lucky you're not here. Do you know who Tom DeHaven is?
I do not. I'm sorry.
All right, Tom DeHaven is a retired teacher of English and creative writing in the University of Virginia. Okay. He's written 5 books about comics, 3 of which is a trilogy about newspaper strips. And he wrote 2 books about Superman. One is a novel called It's Superman. The other is a series of essays called Our Hero, Why Superman Matters. Okay. It's Superman was written in 2005. And what it is a novel. It's a novel that takes everything we know about Superman and his young manhood and puts it through the sieve as if Superman had been created by John Dos Passos and John Steinbeck. It's a very literary novel. It's fantastic. I'm a guy, I read, I have a Kindle. I have a number of Kindles. My wife bought me a Kindle to travel with because in the old days when I would travel, I would pack paperbacks, but I tend to read hardcover books. Now I read Kindle. So I'm reading the hardcover edition copy of this book because I got copies of it. I was in Carlin's office in New York, Christmas time of 2005, and Kupperberg comes in. He's the liaison between DC and Warner Books at the time. And he hands Carlin a copy of the book, and he hands me a copy of the book. And my wife and I are flying a night flight. We're on the 4:00 American flight out of JFK, which is a pretty regular event for us. And I'm reading the book, and we're over Pittsburgh, and I'm weeping piteously. I'm crying like a baby. And she looks at me and says, "What's wrong?" I said, "It's just, this book is breaking my heart. It is so fucking good." I got home, I finished the book, and I got a hold of Tom, and I said, it's a transformative experience. It is so fucking good. It will make you, you should be ashamed.
I put it in my cart.
That's the new edition. The hardcover edition, because these schmucks don't know, had a cover by Chris Ware. Because of course, comics, fuck that shit. Nonsense.
I would get in the third.
The first paperback edition was a still from the Fleischer cartoons.
Oh.
And then the new edition is the painting that used to hang in the lobby of DC Comics. The Harry, what's his name? But yeah, it's just fucking great. If you're a serious Superman fan and you haven't read this book by now, you need to. Are you a Catholic?
Something like that.
You need to go to confession.
I haven't been there in a long time.
You need to talk to your priest. This is just wrong.
I just
if I were Mr. T, I would say I pity the fool.
It's coming next week, so we can talk about it.
And you will let me know how right I am.
Gladly, yeah, definitely.
It's an astonishing piece of work. It will make your heart sing. It's so beautiful. It really is.
That's good because I have to tell you, as much as I love Superman, a fair amount of the Superman stories that I read now don't wow me.
Suck. Because you cannot write the character anymore. The character cannot exist in a modern framework. He only exists because he's a corporate value. The character, I am very curious to see what James Gunn is going to do. The character is so weighted down and so infantilized by the junk that's preceded it that you can't do it. I mean, the character, the last Superman character that had any value, and to a great extent, the character that exists in the novel exists in the Fleischer cartoons.
Mhm.
Okay. There's a level of naivete built into the franchise at its core that makes it impossible to do in modern terms, because we live in a wise guy, wise ass culture. Everybody's a smart guy. Everybody's a wise guy. You know, it's like Batman doesn't have a penis. I'm sorry. Batman was created by a 7-year-old boy who claimed to be 15. These are the creations of children. They are wish dreams. And you cannot age them up to accommodate the audience without losing what is innately of value to the material in the first place. It just cannot be done. They don't. There has to be stasis. It has to be the same, and you can't. And that doesn't work anymore. I mean, you can't do it. You know, Superman's not a Weisenheimer. You know, he's an innocent, and that innocence doesn't play in a modern context. You know, I mean, you can talk all about the Christopher Reeves movies. They're just bullshit too. They really are. The character ceased to have genuine narrative value after the Second World War. The handwriting is on the wall in the covers of Superman's books between 1945 and 1950, when all of a sudden they became sort of comic exercises in domesticity. You know, Superman gets his hair cut. Superman, Lois Lane's biscuits are so hard they fall on his foot and he hurt. You know, you cannot ignore the value that Superman had between 1938 and 1945 for GIs. When the GIs came home, they tried to translate their coming home experience with no success. It's one of the reasons why superheroes went away. Okay. Because you didn't have idiots in the field reading this junk. Okay. And but the character, you cannot do away with the character. But I've said, look, one of the Shadow, for example, okay, one of the reasons the Shadow was identified in the 1930s is because it ceased to have commercial value in 1949. It was canceled. It was vanished. The product just was disappeared. If Superman had been canceled in 1950, Superman would still be identified as a nostalgic item. You'd still be thinking of Superman as a 1930s, 1940s idea with that beautiful outfit. That ever-changing, that shield, which was sometimes triangular, sometimes shield-shaped, depending on whether it was Fred Ray or Jack Burnley, you know. But, or Wayne Boring. Look, I mean, you heard me tell the story. I mean, if you read Krypton Lives On,
mm-hmm.
Okay. I bought that off the newsstand. Okay. I'm 9 years old. I'm sitting on my stoop. I'm reading that. And it just broke my heart. It killed me. Because he got to meet his parents. I was 9. That's how old you have to be. It's like when James Gray, the director, his dentist asked him whether he'd see the Avengers movie. He says, "What am I, 11?" It's a reasonable, you know.
That's a story, though. You know, the Krypton Lives On. You know, they've kind of repurposed that storyline or that premise over and over again over the years, and. You know,
but I was 9. I was available to it. You're not anymore.
No, I completely understand, and I agree with you. But you know, I think as comic book readers, you know, certainly, you know, I got into comics much later in life.
Really?
Well, when I say later, like
how old are you now, and how later?
I'm 44 now. I got into comics in like 92. So when like Superman died. You know, like their big mission was, yeah.
Oh, see, you were already a voter.
No, not yet. No,
Well,
I would.
92. That's true. It's 30 years ago.
Yeah.
Jesus Christ.
No.
Fuck you, man. Fuck you, 90. Fuck you, 90s people. That's right.
Come on, man. Grunge. Awesome. Anyway,
I see your outfit. You know.
No, this is. I was working in my wood shop, so that's what I was doing.
Wait a minute.
You know, as a reader, you know, you get to look at these stories in different with different eyes and different filters over the years, and different appreciation. I think, as a child or as a kid, teens reading these stories is more like, hey, wow, Superman getting beat up and killed and stuff like that. But then you read them over again, I think, and you get a different appreciation for them. Of kind of, I think you pay attention a little bit more. And certainly now, Oren and I, kind of what inspired us to do this is now we're going back further and really doing our homework and, exploring more of the older historic aspect of comics and what came before everything that we loved. And, we certainly have more of appreciation. I mean, Oren, correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, that's
No,
kind
you're
of
right on, money.
our impetus
Look,
for this whole thing.
I one of the pleasures of doing Hey Kids Comics is getting to have a look at all that old stuff again. I just did the back cover of issue 3, which is a knockoff of a knockoff. Okay. Issue 3 is about all the imitation Supermans that came out as a result of Superman coming out.
Oh, yeah.
And I've done a version that's based on I think it's a Fred Ray cover that I've turned into one of the knockoffs, and it drives me crazy because I can't draw like that anymore without really struggling to find a way to draw like a 15-year-old boy. It's hard. I mean, the things I know have to be forgotten to do it. I mean, I have to say that when in the early 80s, Jeanette called me, Frank, Alan, and John. They had me, to come in and pitch Superman. Okay. I was going to do action. Frank was going to do Superman. And Alan was going to do World's Finest. And my pitch, I can give you my pitch, was basically 3 pages of Metropolis waking up on a Monday morning. Everybody's just, the bustle and hustle, multiple panel pages. And among them, we see Clark Kent, getting those other stuff. And the subways, and people are coming out of the subway, just doing all that New York stuff. And then everybody looks up at the sound of a sonic boom and the sound of an off-key voice singing, "You've got the cool, clear eyes of a seeker of wisdom and truth." And you look up, and the double page spread is Superman flying above the roofs of Metropolis, wearing a Walkman, singing along at the top of his lungs. He lands. He changes in the storage room into Clark Kent, and then we realize that everybody in Metropolis knows that Clark Kent is Superman, but they don't want to hurt his feelings, and they really like the idea of being a part of this huge secret. So it's like, keep it down, it's okay. I got laughed out of the room. Okay. But, and what I said when I left the room is, you'll be really lucky because John Byrne really wants to do it just like he wants to do it. And that's what he ended up doing. And I thought, all things considered, John did a pretty interesting job of trying to reinvent Superman to no real success. Mm-hmm. But I don't think you can. I don't think you can. It's one of the reasons why DC seems to be in the Batman business and the Batman business only. Because they don't, we don't know how to write Superman. Well, you can't write Superman the way he should be written. That's the problem. Because you can't, an innocent hero no longer plays. There's a phenomenal novelist of the 1930s, 40s, and 50s named Dawn Powell, who was a mentor to Gore Vidal and Tennessee Williams and John Latouche, who was a forgotten composer and songwriter. And she ran a salon on 9th Avenue between 5th and 6th. And she wrote, most of her novels were about a naive provincial who comes to New York and finds himself or herself trapped up and wrapped up in a bohemian aspect of New York culture, poetry, filmmaking, journalism, fiction, art, only to discover, to his or her dismay, that these bohemians are far more provincial than the world that he or she left behind. And you cannot create, Superman is Candide. You cannot create an innocent hero in a cynical and skeptical time as in which we live. You're dealing with a quasi-Christian culture right now that has transfigured Jesus from that innocent into a belligerent kind of a belligerent, Gnostic figure. And Superman has resonances with Jesus and Moses, and you cannot sell an innocent with such power. Again, I believe. God knows, and God knows, I love that fucking novel because it makes it work. Trust me, read it.
Definitely.
I want to talk a little bit American Flagg. I know you said that was sort of the point in your career where everything you felt kind of gelled.
Yeah.
What was the blueprint? What was going on in your life and what was going on in the world to come up with the story for American Flagg?
The early 80s were defined by people who surrounding me who felt that they could comfortably and effectively vote for Ronald Reagan for his social policies, for his financial policies, but not his social policies. And that struck me as profoundly stupid and self-destructive. Had I known that we were going to go down a deeper shit chute than we did with Reagan, I would have put an end to myself back then. But so much of it was my rage at the way the country was going in the early 80s. Also, I was really high. I was fucked up. I was smoking. I was high 24/7. I really was. And I'm not ashamed of this. It just was what it was, and it's just a different person. More than half my life ago. But Flagg first made me this offer, and I couldn't figure out why they felt comfortable and confident in me to make this offer. And once they made the offer and I accepted it, I realized that I would get out of the financial hole that I'd gotten into working for Byron Price. Nobody made any money working for Byron except for Byron. And Flagg was a demonstration. It was a kitchen sink book. I took Gunsmoke, Terry and the Pirates, and put it all into a burlesque negative utopia. And all of my things I was obsessed with. I was a serious clothes horse at the time. I was very much a fashionista. I was obsessed with women's lingerie. All the women I was married to or dating were heavily decked out because that's what I liked. But I was also an Armani and an Adolfo guy. I was very slick. I was younger and fuckable. I was pretty fuckable looking in those days. And I liked all that stuff. I liked the industrial design and just everything. I took everything I was interested in. I used it as window dressing on this political fun, and I like punning. I like I like puns. I like plays on words. I like I grew up. There was a whole school of comic novelists who existed in the 50s and 60s who have vanished into history. People like Patrick Dennis, Max Schulman, Peter DeVries, these guys who, Jack Douglas, who wrote all this stuff that was just when people read, that informs my sensibility enormously. I was a television person, but I read a lot of comic novels. Patrick Dennis is only remembered now for Anti-Mame, but he wrote a lot of really funny shit, and he was fucking crazy. He ended the last 15 years of his life. He went back to his real name, gave up writing, became a butler. That's fucking insane.
Yeah.
All things.
So yeah, but all that stuff shows up in Flagg. The character names, my original intention was to make it more of an ensemble than I did, but I got stuck being a hero guy. Okay. Anecdotally, when I told somebody the story recently that I was on a panel. We were talking. The first guys were all on a panel. Somebody in the audience asked me what his superpowers were, and I said he can remove his underwear without taking his pants off, and he makes ice cream. Both of which I regarded as pretty damn super.
Yeah. Did you expect it to catch with people as well as it did?
It didn't catch all that well. Its success. It had some. It was a success this time. had nice critical response, but it never sold.
Right.
You know, I sold many more copies of anything than anybody sells today.
Right.
But in those days, I sold a single copy to Frank's 20 of whatever his crap was.
Gotcha.
I never reached the right audience because the book didn't feel like what a comic book should feel like. Mm-hmm. If it had a mask and a cape, it might have, right. But because it didn't truck in those tropes, it wasn't identified as something worthy of conventional ideation. It wasn't about stuff that comic books are about. You know, I don't really, you know, I mean, I consider myself a journeyman talent, and I'm constantly brought up short when people find the work that I do strange. Mm-hmm. A couple years back, I wrote into a Conan story, and the people who had the license were very weirdly uncomfortable with it. I have no idea what. I mean, it was basically about two courtesans, an older woman and a younger woman, and ultimately the older woman murders the younger woman, but pins it on the younger woman's boyfriend, which I thought was, you know, yeah, you know, and they didn't. I mean. Why? Because he wasn't wearing a helmet and slashing people against the head with a sword, you know. But it was King Conan. It was the old guy, you know, and right. Was more interested in sitting in a hot tub getting blown, you know.
With Flagg, did you have an end game in mind for the character? No. Okay.
I don't know.
How difficult? No, go ahead.
I just, you know, just going on, you know, just going on. You know. It ruined my health. It fucked up my marriage. It just, you know, just. But again, I learned what it meant to actually work hard,
right?
And what I could achieve if I committed to the work, which was a real revelation to me. This shit is good, and I'm good at it. Fuck, I can do this.
Well, that
you know, and then I did Times Squared, which demonstrated one more time that I would now invest the rest of my life in overestimating the audience. Sure. Because Times Squared is obscurantist. And it's about stuff that doesn't interest comic book fans. Mm-hmm. But you know, hubris is its own reward.
One last one about Flagg was that, and you just mentioned that you were working hard. You know, you were enjoying what you were writing, and I know you stayed on and you did some drawing for it. But how difficult was it for you to hand over the reins of writing to others, knowing this is a character that you created? You had a story in mind.
I was stunned by how shitty it was. I couldn't fucking believe how awful the work that followed mine was.
Is that heartbreaking though? Because
no, because you know, not really. You know, because it's just work. Mm-hmm. You know, I don't have a. I'm a person. Mm-hmm. The work is the work. You know, I don't have a huge identification with the work as it exists. Mm-hmm. It's behind me. Once it's done, it's there and moved on. You know, I mean, comic books is a one-trick pony business. Mm-hmm. You know, frequently the guys who are really successful get successful at one thing, and if that one thing holds on, it's good. Right. I'm not a one-trick pony because I bore easily. Right. And I do different stuff. And I bring the same level of commitment and craft to whatever I do, but it's always different stuff. Right. You know, his heroes all look alike. Well, yeah, that's not an accident, fucker. There's no gotcha here. You know, that's on purpose. But what you don't notice is the fact that if those characters ever evolved to be translated to film or television, they'd all be played by different actors. I mean, the guy who plays Reuben Flagg is not going to play Maxime Glory. Right. They're two different people. They look alike. Right. But that's, again, it's because all my heroes are distillations of Henry Fonda, William Holden, and James Garner.
Would you say
they represent American manhood mid-20th century?
Excellent. Would you say you have a legacy book or a project that you worked on that you think defines you, or one that you think is most connected to you, or you connect most connected with yourself?
Yes.
What's that?
Times Squared.
Okay.
It's a very personal book. There's buried metaphor throughout that book about my family, about my upbringing, the world in which I grew up, and the frustration of the fact that that legal issues keep it from being made public is damning to my body and heart. It really is. I can't go any deeper than that.
Gotcha.
I want to shift a little bit to.
By the way, the book looks fucking great. I've seen a copy. It's astonishing looking.
Well, fingers crossed. One day.
Yeah, my legs are crossed. That's how much I got. Yeah.
I wanted to.
We're getting close to a close here. It's so.
Yes.
Wrap it up, kid.
Yeah, we're on it. We're on it. Flash TV series. Amazing show. Was that experience enjoyable for you? How did you get involved in it?
It was a gas. I fucking loved it.
And do you love to see that version of the character in the new series?
Never seen it.
No?
No, why would
Let
I
me
watch
tell
that?
you, as
Shame
two
on
fans, two of us.
Shame on you, yeah. We should go
We
confessional.
yeah, get on that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Two
Don't
of
care
us were calling each other up on the phone like little kids again. Like, did you see it?
About John showing up or about the
Yeah.
show?
John Wesley Shipp, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, well, I mean, look, I got hired on the show while I was in New York. I was in New York with my writing partner. We had just sold and cut a deal at DC to do a 5-issue arc of Legends of the Dark Knight with a really, really good artist. He signed off as well. Never heard from him. The book just vanished into the ether. And not an unusual situation. And I got a call from my agent saying that they wanted us to write an episode of The Flash. And that was great, an episode of TV. We come out and she got it wrong because she was an idiot. And they hired us on. They got us really cheap. I mean, incredibly cheap. And within 2 weeks of the beginning of the show, they fired 2 of the other writers. And my writing partner and I ended up writing 7 originals and rewriting 2 freelancers. Okay. And because Danny and Paul were mostly invested in doing Rocketeer rewrites, we were basically setting the tone of the show. And we had a great time. It's a great crew, I'm still pals with these guys. I mean, the last time I publicly bawled was at Paul DeMeo's memorial at USC. Paul died a couple of years ago. I'm still in touch with Danny. I'm still in touch with Gail Hickman, who was one of the EPs on the show. David Newman, who was an assistant AD on the show. I ended up hiring on my last show that I worked on at Tribune. I'm in touch with David. It was some of the best experiences of my life. When they did the 25th anniversary at what the old silent movie theater on Fairfax, one of the comic elements of it was great to see everybody. I spent most of the evening talking to Mark Hamill's wife about real estate. She's an absolute doll. And the high point of the evening was that guy that got shit canned from the new show for sexual harassment.
Yeah.
Spent the entire evening ducking all of us writers of the original series for fear that we were going to hit him up for work. And it was a riot. I'm sitting there talking with Gil. Says, that guy thinks we're going to be hitting him up, right? And yeah, let's fuck with him. It was a great experience. But working for Danny and Paul, I mean, I worked for them again. I worked on Sentinel. I worked on Viper with those guys. Mm-hmm. And I loved working for those guys. It was just, I remember giving a speech when the last show we did together was canceled to the PAs on the staff that this is the best years of your life and enjoy it. And they were speaking for myself as well. Because the next half of my TV career was a shit show. Those people that I wish would die tasting their own blood.
Those are they. Okay.
But Danny and the Flash was just a gas. I had a great time. It was so fucking stupid. But it was a perfect example, what I talked about earlier, about dealing with an older generation of executives who had no idea what we were doing. They wouldn't let us do costume villains. They actively, they would not let us do actual costume characters. And we really wanted to. We couldn't. One of the reasons we were so delighted by Hamill and the Trickster. I mean, the great thing about that last episode of the show, the reason we did all that was because we had all these vehicles that had to be destroyed. So we wrote an entire sequence about this. Like, well, we can't sell them. They're going to get burned. Let's just blow the fuck of them up. And that was,
It was a great show. Just a fantastic series. And the fact that they, but I mean, it just embodied the character. The suit was amazing, better, I think, than the one in the new series. It just,
again, I wouldn't know.
Well, let me tell you,
one day,
yeah,
one day.
Nah, look, no.
Okay, fair enough. I'm still getting that book though. All right, so look,
me. Whoa, snap.
Oh yeah, I went there.
Look, I mean, I loved working on the show. I really did. It was a scholarship to film writing school. It really was. And I my first hour of television ever was directed by a guy named Gus Draconis, who was a member of the cast of West Side Story. He was Goldie Hawn's first husband, who by that time looked like an owl. And it was just one of the greatest experiences ever. Look, the Warner Brothers lot, what ended up being used on ER as the exterior of the hospital was our Central City police station. We had such great building going on. We got to use the lot a lot. And the Warner's lot, if you've ever visited the Warner Brothers lot, it is the best lot in the city. Paramount is a close second. The only thing that Paramount has over the Warner's lot is it has weather. You get snow and rain.
No, interesting.
Whenever you see commercials shot in New York that is obviously not New York, it's all the Paramount lot. Yeah, but it was a great experience. It really was. And again, I mean, I'm still pals with all those guys.
Cool. Well, look, we want to be mindful of your time and your lasagna. So
that sounds like a metaphor that's dirty. Have we covered enough here?
Well,
I mean, we'd love to have you back on at some point.
At some point.
More,
I mean,
when you don't have something in the oven.
This is more fun than I expected, so I'll give you that.
Thank you. We'll make sure Joe reads that book first.
Yeah, I will, and I have lots. I want to touch on next time Black Kiss because I'm fascinated by that.
Why don't we close with a Black Kiss question?
All right. So, where did that come from? And as I recall, when that shipped, that was wrapped in a bag. All right, and it was, that was, kind of a big deal for that, type of book. And I remember reading that you were kind of pissed at DC for wanting to impose warning labels for books or, mature material type of
there was collusion
rankings
going on. Carmine and Stan were trying to collude on creating a rating system. And I was on my high horse. Again, I was high. So I was like, oh, and I was approached synchronistically by Bill Marks, who was running Vortex. Their book was Mr. X. And he and Lou Stathis did a full court press on me. He said, let's do a dirty comic book. I said, okay. And do you have any ideas? And I said, as a matter of fact, I do. And I moved to California the day before I turned 35. It was October the 6th, 1985. That September, I was walking on Madison Avenue, and I saw a woman that I had dated a decade earlier at the end of the street, waiting for a light to change. And I caught up with her, and it turned out not to be her. It turned out to be a transvestite who looked exactly like her. And I said, And in those days, I carried a book bag from a place called Monkey Soup or something like that. It was a Danish school bag. And I reached inside, had a notebook. I wrote, twins connected by a penis. And filed it. I said, how about this, Bill? And that was the franchise. Okay. So the book was Canadian. It was until I did the Wolverine Nick Fury thing with Archie at Marvel. Was the single most profitable thing I've ever done in my life. We were banned in the UK, banned in Canada. I was excoriated in a review by Grant Morrison. Grant Morrison. And anecdotally, I never did a sequel until 2000. I've been solicited to do a sequel for years. I finally came up with a sequel after I read Stephen Sondheim's first book of his annotation of his lyrics, when I realized that the song that closes the first act of Follies, I'm Still Here, is a fictional version of Joan Crawford's life. And I said, that's the franchise. So that's how I did the sequel. And the sequel was again banned in the UK. And I was banned in Canada as well, but then invited to speak the following year at the Canadian Writers' Conference about being banned in Canada, which is one of the greatest experiences of my life. It really was. So,
but did that piss you off? The fact that they wanted to kind of, keep this, wrapped up in a black bag and
no, not at all. I thought it was a ride. We originally thought about including a condom.
That's awesome. All right, fair enough.
I work, but we are going to do a final Black Kiss story.
Okay.
It's called the Black Kiss Halloween Special, and it'll be a 20-page story because there's an omnibus edition of Black Kiss in Spanish, Italian, and German, and there is not an English language version one. My dogs are pissed. They've been fed up. Fuck those guys. And we're going to do a Halloween special, and that's the deal.
All right. Well, look, I'm not going to.
This has been an absolute gas. I've had a much better time than I deserve. Thanks so much.
Thank you,
Mr. Chaykin.
All right. Look, hey, everyone, if you love this episode as much as we did recording it for you, please rate, review, subscribe, and be sure to.
And don't be honest. Say nice things about me as opposed to, whenever I do show, like when I do Graham Nolan's thing, they're always like, why are you dealing with that asshole? He's horrible. He's a left-wing, whatever.
We love you.
And welcome back. Look, hey, that man doesn't hold back, right? I can respect the honesty. Certainly he has some opinions, but I think that's what makes our show interesting, is hearing these people's opinions. We don't have to agree with them. Just hear them out. I love talking to him. I loved his honesty. Yeah, I'm kicking myself. We didn't get to cover Die Hard Year One, which was following John McClane's like rookie year as a cop in New York City. It's so cool. As a big Die Hard fan, I really would wish we gotten into that. But look, he's done so much. We can only cover so much in our time, right?
Yeah, you hit the nail around the head. He has done so much. I mean, every sort of genre of comics he's been a part of. And his writing, it speaks for itself. It's powerful. It makes you think. It tells an incredible story. And to combine all those three things, you really need to be good at your craft. And Howard most certainly is very good at his craft. So we'd love to have him back on. Thank you, Howard. Thank you, listeners, for checking us out this week. And we will see you again soon.